I now give the floor to His Excellency Lejeune Mbella, Minister of External Relations of Cameroon.
Monsieur le Président,
Mr. President, I have the honor of delivering before this august assembly the entire statement that His Excellency Paul Biya, President of the Republic and Head of State, authorized me to deliver on his behalf. And I quote, Mr. President, first of all, I would like to express to you my sincere congratulations upon your election to the presidency of this 79th session of the United Nations General Assembly. Your accession to this senior position is a source of pride for your country, Cameroon, as well as for Africa and the international community. I would like to express our gratitude to those member states that supported your candidacy and elected you, in particular those from Africa, who nominated you unanimously as the candidate of our continent. I commend the work and achievements of your predecessor, His Excellency Ambassador Dennis Francis of Trinidad and Tobago, who was able with determination to lead the work of the 78th session of the General Assembly. Lastly, I take this opportunity to reiterate the support and appreciation of Cameroon for the Secretary General, Mr. Antonio Guterres, who, despite the many situations facing our world at this moment, is working tirelessly for the advancement of the ideals, the purposes and the principles of the Charter of the United Nations, and working to ensure the success of our shared organization. Mr. President, you decided to place at the heart of the general debate of this 79th session the theme, leaving no one behind, acting together for the advancement of peace, sustainable development, and human dignity for present and future generations. This theme, it must be underscored, expresses the urgent need for joint action in a difficult and complex international climate with both challenges and opportunities. Among those challenges, we need to note that our shared home, the planet Earth, is the victim of extreme climate disruption, which is jeopardizing the physical survival of some countries and forest and coastal areas in various regions of the world. Torrential rainfall and subsequent devastating flooding, as we have seen in recent months in Africa, in Europe, and in Asia, as well as heat waves, landslides, are all the most visible symptoms of this. And some countries suffer them more than others. Today, people displaced due to climate change are now as numerous as are refugees and internally displaced persons who are victims of war. This is no longer a spectre, but rather a painful daily reality in many places. And yet we agreed upon a set of measures to combat these scourges in the Paris Agreement and in many other subsequent commitments. Cameroon, which is a state party to this agreement and which belongs to the Congo Basin Great Forest Massif, is sparing no effort to find relevant solutions together with neighboring countries to the global current climate crisis. Consequently, we firmly call for the measures that we adopted together in the Paris Agreement to effectively be applied without any hindrance or delays. Unfortunately, the financial and technical means and resources that constitute the primary means of implementation of this agreement continue thus far to be mobilized in a very parsimonious way. Mr. President, ladies and gentlemen, on top of this climate crisis, there are conflicts and hotbeds of tension, both old and new, that spare no geographical area. The Sahel, Sudan, Gaza, Lebanon, and Ukraine are the most illustrative examples of this. This sort of situation is driving an arms race, including in space, in the seas and the oceans. It is also driving a greater use of light weapons as well as weapons of mass destruction. It constitutes a serious threat of the use of nuclear weapons. And lastly, it is also generating geopolitical tensions, all sorts of rivalries and mistrust between states, giving rise to a threat to peace, security, and international stability. If nothing is done urgently, we may be forced to once again, in the near future, live through another dark chapter in the history of humanity, as was the case at the beginning of the 20th century. For Cameroon, it is important that we reverse this trend as quickly as possible. We must do this in order to save ourselves from a war and the scourges that come with it, in order to preserve future generations in light of the ideals advocated by the founding fathers of the United Nations. My country remains convinced that the use of dialogue, consultation, consensus, preventive diplomacy, confidence-building measures, these must always take priority in order to guarantee lasting peace in our world. To achieve this, we must proceed with a reform of the Security Council in order to make sure that it continues to fully fulfill its original mandate as the principal organ responsible for the maintenance of peace and security. Given that Africa is still the only continent that does not have a permanent member on the Security Council, it is essential and urgent that this injustice be corrected and that our continent be able to, as is its right, have equitable representation as a separate member in this important, a fully fledged member in this important organ. This calls for the granting of 2 permanent seats with veto rights and 2 other additional non-permanent seats. Mr. President, Excellencies, ladies and gentlemen, when we adopted the document entitled The Future We Want, as well as the 2030 Sustainable Development Goals, the aim was to begin a decisive battle against underdevelopment. 4 years ago, at the celebrations of the 75th anniversary of the United Nations, we took further commitments, reaffirming that the Sustainable Development Goals are our action plan, the application of which is a question of life and death. As we approach the 2030 deadline that we set ourselves, we must acknowledge that the expected results are far from being achieved, as is made manifest in various progress reports presented by the Secretary-General. As we saw earlier, in the context of the Paris Agreement to protect the planet, financial and technological means of implementation have not yet been fully mobilized. For that reason, Cameroon once again calls for renewed political will and more decisive action to overcome this situation. The new Doha Programme of Action for the Least Developed Countries, the Antigua and Barbuda Programme of Action for Small Island Developing States, and the Programme for Landlocked Developing Countries that will be adopted at the upcoming conference in Gaborone in December, as well as the African Union 2063 agenda, together with its second decade of priorities, the Continental Free Trade Zone. These are all, in our view, frameworks for guidance and incentives for the development of the poorest countries that need to be actively implemented if we want to leave no one behind. In this regard, Cameroon, for its part, has undertaken a number of structural projects in the sectors of energy, transport infrastructure, communication and telecommunications, extractive industries and processing, as well as many other sectors, with the aim of becoming an emerging country by 2035. Mr. President, plans, projects and programs for recovery and reconstruction, as well as humanitarian action, have been set up by our government to respond to the special and urgent needs of populations, above all those living in rural areas or those affected by the abuses of the terrorist sect Boko Haram in the far north of Cameroon, as well as those resulting from the socio-political crisis in the far north, the northwest, and the southwest regions. I would like to take this opportunity to sincerely and firmly thank our bilateral and multilateral partners for their constant support for our national progress and development agenda, and I would like to invite them to continue to do us the honor of their faithful and loyal support. Mr. President, Excellencies, ladies and gentlemen, all of the actions undertaken by developing countries will only produce the expected results if the global macroeconomic framework is reformed. This framework, need we recall, is based on institutions that have been there since the Second World War, institutions that have become obsolete, and the structure and organization of which are in large part at the source of disruption, imbalances, dysfunctioning, and even inequalities that still are not conducive to the full development of poor countries and the global south. Consequently, Cameroon echoes the appeal and the movement aiming for the reform of the international economic and financial architecture. This appeal and this movement focus in particular on the better representation of developing countries in these institutions, as well as more equitable taxation, appropriate monetary policy, more sustainable debt, a better adapted energy transition, healthy agriculture, controlled industrialization, and decent work. Mr. President, Excellencies, ladies and gentlemen, we welcome the holding here on the 22nd and 23rd of September 2024 of the Summit of the Future, which we participated in, and above all, the adoption of the Pact for the Future and its two annexes on the digital sphere and future generations. This pact, once again, commits us to the active pursuit of peace, sustainable development, and human dignity, thanks to a series of concrete actions that require the consequent means of implementation. We cannot deprive ourselves of these actions which could open up the way to the future we want in the context of a reinvigorated multilateralism supported by the ideals, the purposes and the principles of the United Nations Charter. It is a question of safeguarding the planet, building peace, bringing about sustainable development with first and foremost, the eradication of poverty, shared prosperity, and full respect for human rights focused on human dignity. Unless there is the necessary clear political will, the means for the active implementation of the provisions agreed in this pact and its annexes, we risk not achieving, as we would like to do, the desired results, and in so doing we would disappoint present and future generations. At this juncture, allow me to appeal for a mobilization from all corners in order to resolutely implement these provisions and to prove those skeptics wrong that have lost faith in the United Nations. As our organization, our shared organization, prepares to celebrate its 80th anniversary, let us give ourselves the means to modernize. Let's also give ourselves the resources to effectively respond to the expectations that have been placed in our organization, to respond to the present challenges and to keep alight the flame of a more humanist international cooperation. Mr. President, Excellencies, ladies and gentlemen, we are living through a time of threats and challenges to peace and development, but also one of great opportunities. We have at our disposal the resources we need, thanks to the prodigious development of science and technology, as well as artificial intelligence. It is now up to us to set aside our selfishness and to act in solidarity with a sense of collective responsibility in order that we may together overcome the challenges that no country can face alone. In doing so, it is up to us to make proper use of these resources to ensure the well-being and survival of the planet and the human race, today and in the future, in the context of constant vigilance an enlightened awareness and an in-depth reflection on the part of the international community about controlled globalization. End of quote. Thank you for your kind attention.
I thank the Minister of External Relations of Cameroon.